everybody, I'm Pastor A.J. Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 7. Our guest for today is Pastor Ray Ranker, who is the pastor of Humble Walk Lutheran Campus Ministry in College Park, Maryland, which is at the University of Maryland. And he is also the president of the Lumen Network board. Just throwing that out there. So we have the big head honcho with us here today for Lutheran Campus Ministries.
Yeah, right. Great to be with you, AJ.
Yeah,
Thanks
glad
for
you
having
could
me.
join us. Ray is a super cool pastor at a super cool campus ministries at a super cool college, and someday I will take his job.
We've already talked about that, so I'm actually, trying to be proactive and just so we can do team ministry instead of,
Beautiful. Yeah, it's fantastic. No, this is great. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing a little bit of your wisdom with us here at the 10-Foot Pole.
No, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks. Yeah. So today, Pastor Ray and I are going to talk about the gospel lesson for Sunday, November 5th, which is All Saints Sunday, if those are celebrating it. But we're not talking about the All Saints gospel lesson. We're talking about just the normal lectionary, ordinary time. I don't remember what the number is. So the non-All Saints gospel lesson. If you happen to go to a church that is not reading the All Saints Sunday gospel lesson, this is what you're going to hear. It's going to be Matthew 23 verses 1 to 12, which is, so this is like where we've been journeying here at the last throughout the Matthew recently, the Gospel of Matthew. So we've been in 21, 22, and now we're hitting up 23, and just kind of closing out some of, Jesus's real ranty speeches before we get into Advent and go back to the beginning. So I'm going to read Matthew 23 verses 1 through 12, and I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, which really isn't that different, but I feel up to date these days. Okay. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructor, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So one thing I just want to get out of the way real quick here as we talk about it is I said a super fancy word.
Phylactery.
Phylacteries.
A great pronunciation, and you don't see that too often in the Gospels.
Thanks. I actually looked up the pronunciation and practice because I 100% wanted to make sure that I wasn't gonna mispronounce
If you're trying to convince people that you know what you're talking about, that's a good idea, right?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Anyways, so that word, the phylacteries. So another word that you might hear more commonly used for this is tefillin. So what they are these little like wooden boxes. I'm using my hands to describe it to Ray. Like he doesn't know what I'm talking about. No one else can hear what what my hands are doing. I just all the time. They're these wooden boxes that they tie either around their foreheads or their arms, like around their biceps, and then like all the way winding around their arms. And they hold little pieces of scrolls that have parts of the Torah written on them as part of a prayer thing. So my understanding too is, so in understanding totally what this is, so they're used for certain types of prayers, right? And so like they would wear them. You can look it up. It's you get a lot of images. They still use them mostly in more Orthodox churches. You'll see boys and men over the age of 13 that wear them. I understand you can also see in some other forms of Judaism, like conservative Judaism, you'll see women wearing them too. And then in like Reformed and Reconstructionist Judaism, you're not going to see anybody wearing them. So it's like, it's a thing. Anyways, but my understanding is, so the Hebrew word for it is tefillin or tefillah, but tefillin is like the plural version of it. And so that's what most of the time like they're gonna say, most Jewish folks. And so the phylactery is the word in Greek, which is why it shows up in our New Testament, that it's the Greek word. But I also understand that like all tefillins are phylacteries, but phylactery is actually a broader term that is just like something that holds something sacred. So like things that hold relics are technically types of phylacteries. And other religions and stuff will use them to hold amulets, like stones that have magical powers and stuff. So like that's that those would also be phylacteries. But my assumption here, as Jesus is talking to rabbis in the synagogue, that he is indeed talking about the tefillins, these prayer phylacteries that they would have.
Yeah, that would make
Seem
sense.
reasonable assumption?
Yeah, no, for sure. And if you, I've had the opportunity to go to the Holy Land quite a bit, and you can see today observant Jews at the Western Wall
Mm-hmm.
or in other synagogues. Often, like you said, the men will have these. I mean, it looks like a little box that has a strap around it.
Mm-hmm.
I notice them most when they're on somebody's like forehead,
Yeah.
and the idea of having Torah and the Word of God so close to you and to your, I mean, I think especially around your head, like the idea of it being so close to kind of your brain and your being can have some wonderful imagery. But Jesus seems to be talking about people who make these boxes a little more noticeable and a little bigger and maybe more for show, so other people can notice
I
them.
hear do you hear like maybe this is me reading it from a female perspective, but the way Jesus says it, it feels like a big truck complex, like oh, you make your phylacteries big and your fringes long. What are we compensating for over here?
I could totally see an SNL skit around phylacteries here. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I don't know. That's the kind of thing I hear. But so that's what he's pointing out. So Jesus had been kind of preaching at these church leaders for a while. He now, like, basically in the middle of his speech, turns and looks at the crowds and his disciples and says, look at them, right? And now he's talking about them. And then in verse 8, he goes back to talking to them. Now, do you know what's really, so at verse 13, so right where this cuts off, this is where Jesus just starts yelling at them. And it doesn't come up in the lectionary. We like skip to Matthew 25 right there. Like we don't want to, we apparently don't want to make the pastors preach about all of Jesus's, like I mean, he said some pretty troubling things in our last few Sundays gospel lessons, but now he's like really like, it gets even worse.
Woe to you, blind guides!
Yeah. You hypocrites.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, he's not holding back
No.
here for sure. And I mean, it's interesting. I think in some ways the shortened lectionary text, I mean, it gets it gets the main point across without getting too much into the,
Yeah.
hurling insults kind of thing. Uh, but I do think as we jump into this, it's important to mention that this texts like these have been used
Mm-hmm.
to, I don't know, further anti-Semitic beliefs.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I think is really important to kind of, as I think about this text and others, we often are so ready to point to the people and be like, oh, those people, man, they
Yeah.
always get it wrong. And it's really hard for us to like see ourselves in some of those things that where we fall short. So for instance, as I was thinking about this text, I remember we have there's a Hope Lutheran Church right next to campus, and we have parking there that we have for our students who are active in the ministry. It's free parking on a college campus in an urban area. Like, free parking is a
Yeah.
pretty hard to come by, but it means that other people park there who aren't supposed to. And there's one day in particular that I remember there's somebody who had parked there 5 days in a row. We had left, or maybe not even 5 days in a row, but 5 days. We write down, we left these notes, and we were like, come on, man. And then it was like, okay, look, if you do this again, we're gonna have to tow you. And I hate doing that. Um, and I just remember getting so worked up about it. Those people who can't, obey the parking, da 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 da. And I remember I had to run over to the chapel on campus, and I had stuff in the car, and I have a parking pass for not too far away, but I came up on the side of the chapel, put my blinkers on, ran up with this big box, came back, and I had a parking ticket.
Mm.
And I was like, ooh, God, you got me. You got me. That was me. I'm pointing the finger at all those other people. I don't know if have you heard, AJ, the what do they call it? Like the Disney princess syndrome? Like, we can all see ourselves in the heroes and the heroines and of the stories, but we can never see ourselves as, the villains or the people who are
Yeah.
causing issues. And I think a lot of the anti-Semitism that some folks spew from some of the scripture comes from that, where
Yeah.
we want to, it makes us feel better to point at the people who get it wrong, who mess up. It's easier for us
Mm-hmm.
to pounce on other people in today's society than to recognize that, like, Jesus isn't talking about Jews. He's talking about his own people. He's talking about people that we know and see, and that are sometimes us, who get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I try my best to remember that as I look at these types of passages.
Yeah, it's a really great point to point out to talk about this. So, because Jesus, he says a couple of things that makes it seem like, oh, well, the laws aren't important. That's not what it's about. It's about this, 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 and this. And we get this literary context where like the Pharisees serve as the villains for this, like the message that the author wants to get across of what Jesus is saying, right? And so then all of a sudden you get this entire picture that like Jesus good, Jews bad. And that's not what's happening at all. And I think what's always important to remember is that Jesus was born, lived, and died a faithful Jewish man. And what that means and how do we put that into context. I think the big thing that like Jesus is really getting at here is like he's like, great, and this applies to Christians, by the way. Christians have all sorts of shit that we call our rules that are like our quote traditions that we must do every Sunday, the things that we wear, the way we wave our hands, all of those things. I want to be clear, like, right? This is not, so he is looking at his own church leaders and he's saying, like, listen, great, do all those things. Fantastic. That's not what it means to actually fulfill God's expectations of us. And what does this actually look like, right? Like, what are God's expectations of us? And this is where he talks about acting with mercy and justice, right? Like, that's the more important part. But also to recognize that, like, Jesus isn't anti-law. I mean, he still himself lives within the Jewish law, and like says, I haven't come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill the law, right?
Right, that's a major theme for Matthew,
Yeah.
especially throughout. You even like I think the imagery, for instance, of the Sermon on the Mount, connecting Jesus with in that prophetic tradition of Moses. I mean, Moses who goes up on the mountain and gets the law, like Jesus is not here to abolish that. He's
Yeah.
people who would have been following Jesus, people who would have been reading this, would have recognized that, yes, this is Jesus in the tradition. Knowing that too, I mean, I think you were touching on this too. In Jewish tradition, there are a lot of different rabbis who have interpreted the law. I mean, I was just having a conversation with a student about this because this is so fascinating. Sometimes we want, it's like, hey, just tell it to me plain. What do I need to know? Yes or no on
Yeah.
this? And I think all of us kind of at different points want a little bit of that, right?
Yeah.
And then you get something like, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Great. Oh, right. That seems so, I got it. It seems simple, right? But wait a minute. What does it mean to rest? Like how, like,
Mm.
does this count as work? And so for instance, sometimes we might think of simple thing like that. People genuinely wanted to know okay, this is how I want to be and how God wants me to be. What does that mean when it comes to, should I be collecting the wheat in the fields? Should I be lighting a fire to bake bread? The Jews in the wilderness were given manna every day, but on the Sabbath they weren't given manna. They were told to collect 2 days worth the day before. And so anyway, you have different rabbis who are helping people and interpreting, really, right? What that means in that context of that time. And so Jesus, um, in some ways also interpreting things and shining light right here and many
Mm.
places on what's the key part, what's the important part here. Are we
Yeah.
worried too much about the color of the carpet in the church? Are we worried too much? I funny story, we at the church next to campus, we started doing our worship in the fellowship hall, and I wanted couches and I wanted to have a nice, like a casual, comfortable vibe, right? Well, the church had removed like several pews from the upstairs church for handicapped accessibility and also to make like maybe a children's corner. And they didn't want to get rid of them. So they put them around the outside of the fellowship hall. So these, hard wooden benches. And I remember the first time asking, can I get rid of these and just get some couches that we can use? And these these benches were not used for really much of anything, but folks still had such an aversion to getting rid of those. It actually took a year or two for me to finally kind of convince and like wear down, like, this will actually be good. It'll be more of an atmosphere students will want to like be in and as we worship. And I just think about like, man, that energy could have been used on something else. It could have just been like,
Yeah.
yeah, no problem, we're not using them, sure, this will help further the mission of the church, great. um I think about those kind of things with stuff like this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of, you're right, of what Jesus is getting at. And it's not that, and again, he's not telling them that like they're like that it's bad to like follow their rules, but just like it's about having perspective, right? And I think that's the big key. And it's also about how they go about, I think. So I guess I really like Martin Luther's understanding of what he means about like fulfilling the law through these things of like mercy and justice and how we do things, of sort of like his explication of the eighth commandment, right? That it's the eighth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against, thy neighbor, right? And so Martin Luther says it's like, well, it's not that you should just not do bad things against them. It's that you're actually supposed to like do not like good things, right? Like you're supposed to view them in the best possible light, give them the benefit of the doubt. He says, he uses the language, you're supposed to cloak them in your own honor. And that's how we fulfill the law in the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so to me, that's like, I still find that's the most beautiful way of understanding this idea of what Jesus is talking about. He's saying, I come to fulfill the law. He's not against it, but he's saying, what you're doing is not what God's expectations are. This is what God's actual expectations are. And that, again, it's not Jews bad. No, like it's the fact that like all of us need to hear that. And I think that's what's beautiful about us continuing to have these scriptures as a part of our faithful understanding and of who God is and what does it mean to fulfill God's expectations.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I mean, in a way, going back to an earlier part here, I mean, I think sometimes, again, this is human nature. We kind of divide ourselves into teams. I'm on this team and you're on that team. And of course, my team is good, right? Like everybody thinks my team is the right one and the good one, right? We actually have a professor here at University of Maryland, Dr. Mason, who has studied especially partisanship, but in the lens of like people have this team understanding, like whatever team I'm on, we're the right team. And they've done experiments where they've actually given groups of people, they've just told them, hey, this is your team and your identity, and this is the other team. And then they watch what they do and they vilify the other team and they puff up their own. I mean, this is, just these kind of experiments. It's human nature. And I think we do a great disservice when we read stuff like this and think about we're team Jesus, those bad Pharisees are other team. And, of course, Jesus is always talking about those people and never my people. And instead, I think about just this one, verse here, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. And I could say, you know what? My team, we're good on that. We're not the ones going around with bullhorns and yelling at people, you're going to hell unless ... But I won't say are there, what are the ways that we're turning people away from God and from genuine loving relationship? Because there are ways. And if we're not willing to confront that in ourselves, then I think we're missing the boat here.
I'm going to ask the question. So I posed this question to Pastor Ray before we started, but a somewhat provocative question from the Church of Scotland that they put out in their materials for this Sunday. They said, collectively, are there features of our church culture, behaviors, or modes of leadership and teaching that bear any resemblance to this ridicule? And how might outsiders view us? I think that's the key, right? Like if it's not that, it's not anti-Semitic, it's not those other people, it's like Jesus is like, hey, I'm looking you directly in the face. What are you doing? What are we doing? What are we doing that we could be doing better? What are we doing that's putting up these blockades? What are we doing that makes it look like we care more about having our big phylacteries and our long fringes, right?
Oh yeah.
Is your stained glass more important than the homeless guy on the side of the sidewalk?
There's I don't know, AJ, if you ever got into like Christian rock. I mean, I still love DC Talk music, and they have a song, What If I Stumble? And I remember when I saw them at a one of these concerts, the lead singer says, I wish we would have done it differently, and I wish we wouldn't have said what if I stumble, but what if we had said what when I stumble? And this question too that the Church of Scotland poses, instead of are there, I would change it to what are.
Yeah.
because
Yeah, yeah,
there
yeah.
are
What are
absolutely,
the features of our church or behaviors and modes of leadership?
because I think there's plenty of ways. Um, I mean, I think a lot of churches that I come in contact with are baffled. They're begging me. They're like, "Hey, Ray, you're a campus pastor, right? You work with young adults. Our theology and everything seems to line up with what young people believe, and right where people are. Well, why aren't people coming here?" Um, and in some ways, you know, often as I get to go around to a lot of churches to supply and guest preach,
Yeah.
and a lot of places seem like they're going through the motions, if I
Hmm.
can dare say. Um, they're they want to make sure they get the liturgy right, and don't get me wrong, that's not my way of saying that's not important. But if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, how is this community of believers making a real difference
Hmm.
in their community and in the world? Um, Sometimes that's a bit harder to discern.
Yeah. I think I've said this before on the podcast. But I took a training at the LCA a few years ago, that I don't recommend actually. But there were a couple of good nuggets. And one of the things that one of the presenters talks about, and these were not Lutherans, they were not, I don't even think active like church leaders whatsoever. It was about like it was just about that, about what are you doing? And the presenter was talking about, she's like, I get invited to churches all the time. And like, what is your church doing? Like, you're inviting me to sit and worship on Sunday morning, sit quietly for an hour and listen to other people talk. And she said, I'm like, I can do without that, right? Like that's an invitation I can pretty easily decline. But she says, when I get an invitation that says, hey, listen, me and my church peeps need some help right now. I need you to grab your signs and meet us out on Third Ave because we have to protest, what's happening here. And she's like, that's an invitation that I can say yes to every time, right? Like what are we doing in our community? Like what is your identity of what you're being called to do? And that just still it sticks with me a lot because so something through the pandemic, I remember sitting at the very first in-person synod assembly post-pandemic out in Ocean City. I guess it would have been, I think it was 2022. I had a baby. I had a 5-month-old with me as well. But I'm sitting at this table uh and I'm sitting at this table and I'm it was assigned seating that year. It was actually kind of weird and I didn't totally enjoy it, but at the same time I would have never sat with these other two churches. And no one from my church came. Like I was alone. I was my only representative. But there was a church that was is a black church in Baltimore City, and then the other church was this white rural church out like close to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, like really getting on the edge of the Maryland, just like totally opposite spectrum, sitting there. And everyone had the same problem though, that like people stopped coming to church when the pandemic came. We went online, blah blah blah, and so many people didn't come back. And they're just like torn, like their churches feel empty. How do we get these people back? And they're just still in this place of grief and lamenting that like people aren't coming. And I just asked, I was like, well, what are you guys doing? And they didn't understand what I was saying. I was like, well, like, why do you want them to be there? Is it just to have butts in the seats, or what is it that you want to invite people into?
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I said to my own churches that I was serving at the time that like lamented that people weren't coming back. I said, well, what are we inviting them into? Are you just inviting people because you want there to be more asses in the seats on Sunday, or are you actually inviting people into something?
Hmm. We
And that might be the big question of our time.
Right. And I know so many are struggling with this, and it's so hard to, I mean, in a lot of ways, there's no easy answers, but it's a lot of work. When we just had 10 German students come and visit our campus ministry. We've had this relationship in Munich with
Oh,
the
that's pretty
Collegium
cool.
Ecumenicum. It's this basically the best way to describe it is a Lutheran church owned dormitory for students, and they run programs, and
Is that
it's
where
not just
Bridget
for little.
Gattieri is at right now?
I don't think so,
Okay,
but
because I
well,
know
not that I know of, I should
that
say.
they just got ordained to do something. Oh, okay, continue. Sorry, I interrupted your
Yeah,
story.
no worries. But so we had these 10 Germans, and they stayed with our students, and they came, like, we put together a program for them, and it was amazing. It's amazing to have outside eyes to look at what you're doing.
Hmm.
And I hope that I'm always able and willing to hear what outside eyes see, and what they hear. And it was refreshing. you know we brought them to worship, and they'd be like, why do you do that? Like, but not in a judgmental way, but like,
Yeah.
that's weird, or that's something I've never experienced. um we took them I took them up to Baltimore, to Breath of God Lutheran Church.
Yep.
The pastor there is my best friend, and we were roommates in college, Mark Parker. And
Pastor
they
Mark has also been a guest on our podcast.
oh yeah, oh well, great.
Mhm.
um but they were just blown away. These people had not experienced church that was connected to their community like that church was.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
fact that they opened a child care, because that was a big need in the community. They bought the house next door after a fire and converted it into a refugee resettlement house. The feeding program that just sprang into being because of COVID, and people weren't getting the meals that they relied on at schools. And I mean, it was so amazing hearing them. And they, in their reflections and their evaluations at the end, they said, something like, this is the kind of church that I want to be a part of. Like, this is what church is and should be.
Yeah.
And I want to find that. So, I mean, I guess maybe for the thing that I need to remind myself, and for listeners, I think too, is just, how can we get some outside eyes on what we're doing? I mean, I just get so caught up, and
Yeah.
well, even I, who wants to say like, oh yeah, let's try something new. And I have a lot more freedom. We have a lot of freedom to do that in campus ministry.
Yeah.
But sometimes I catch myself, well, we tried that once 8 years ago and it didn't work. So nah. Or like, I mean,
Yeah.
even I can find myself falling into the same kind of mentalities, that I, again, might be so quick to point the finger at those other places.
Hmm.
And I'm doing some of those same things.
I think so. My thing is, I think what also Jesus is pointing at, and what you're naming that we see in ourselves and in all of our churches and in context, is like there's just a little bit of human nature there.
A
Um,
lot of human nature.
and well, so what does it mean for us to? I think to right. So how do we say it? We own it. That we recognize this thing in ourselves, and that we continually call ourselves and others out into the unknown. Right.
Into the
Yeah,
unknown.
as soon as I said it, I was like, "Oh, there goes my Elsa coming out again." It's been a few episodes. I have reflected, so like I have a 20-month-old little girl, and we listen to a lot of Elsa, like a lot. Like I've already
Well,
watched Elsa today and heard
only
most of the
once? No, I'm just
soundtrack.
kidding.
It's
So no, I think that's really helpful, AJ. And I think, and I know folks know this, but clergy or folks, deacons, people who work in churches, like, chances are we all want and hope and genuinely are working towards a community that better reflects God's
mm-hmm.
desire for us to be in loving community, with the neighborhood, with God, with the world. And it's frustrating at times, sometimes, how slow or like
Yeah.
that can happen. But I'll tell you, it's such a joy when you have uh, somebody new who comes in and really just catches that spirit, or is filled with the Spirit and wants to do something. And I think it's on us to do our best to help enable that to happen.
Mhm.
I have a student who is, discovering Christianity like for the first time outside of whatever the media and whatever the kind of things. And when that person has invited more people to the
Yeah.
ministry
Yeah.
in 6 weeks than some have in a decade.
Yeah.
But it's hard. I mean, I don't. We struggle. I know so many of us struggle with that. How can we do this better? And we get bogged down, and we get, yeah, frustrated too, in the ways that I and my people can sometimes be acting in focusing on the things that aren't the most important things.
Yeah. And I think, that's why we're continuing lifelong to learn and to reflect and to grow, right? Like I always so the thing is, I mean, it's a slightly different question here, this question of like, what does it look like to fulfill God's expectations, or what is it that, that Jesus is really getting at? I always just think like, is this further in the kingdom? When something comes up, right? And like sometimes the answer is yes, right? In some of these trivial things, right? Like there's some things that like, there someone might be really upset about something, and to us it sounds like what color's the carpet, right? But like, is this furthering the kingdom? Like, what is it about this person's relationship here, um, that matters in this moment? And so sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I think that there are those life-giving moments in there, but it's just a matter of, I think, taking the time and understanding what the perspective is.
Yeah. No, that's a great question to ponder. And for folks who might be frustrated at their church, and trust me, there's been a lot of times when I've been frustrated with my church, and um I've heard folks talk about evolution, not revolution, and how to. I think it's what I appreciate is when folks are going through some frustration, either with God or with community, that they don't just cut themselves off or
Mm,
just like check out, but they kind of take a piece of what they have a vision of what God's calling them to do and just do that. And there are a lot of hurting people in
mm,
our communities and in this world. And so um, maybe that is, we want to have like these grand programs and grand things. And maybe it's really visiting somebody in the hospital.
yeah.
Maybe it is sitting with somebody who's in mourning. And those are part of those ways. Because I think too, and sometimes we can get so caught up in the frustrations and that our energy just goes towards kind of the frustration and anger, whether it's at those other people or whether it's even at our people, that we kind of lose the energy and the ability to say, what's that positive vision and how am I just going to be a small part of that today?
Yeah, I love that. I think it's important that we're continuing to ask the questions. And what's important is how do we look at this introspectively, right? Like if I'm the person Jesus is yelling at right now, what are my long fringes? What's my big phylactery that I need to look at and examine? I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's where I'm at with it.
Yeah. I feel that. I mean, there are times, especially in ministry, where there's a lot of paperwork or meetings or things like that that just feel like they need to happen. And then sometimes I'm like, am I just filling my time with these kind of things that am I missing the boat? Um, Folks, I've talked to students about, doing some of that kind of discernment. And one kind of astutely pointed out, like, it's tiring. It's tiring to always
Absolutely
be
exhausting.
asking God, what are you calling me to do, and what am I going to do about it? And um, I want to recognize that and name that. And I mean, part of the reason why we named our ministry the Humble Walk is because we like this image of walking. Like, it's a journey.
Yeah.
There's movement involved. You never arrive at, I have finally reached this stage and great, I can stop. And because God keeps calling. God didn't just create and is back chilling somewhere. Like, God continues to create, and the
Mm-hmm.
Spirit continues to move. And so with this gospel reading too, like, how do we do that humbly? With humility? That
Yeah, I mean, he does say that at the end there too, right? Like, that is, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. That's what it is.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And thank God for that, because I get it wrong. I get it wrong.
Yeah, we all do. That's why we're learning. And again, I think it's important to just keep walking, right? And that it is a journey, and that we do keep learning and we keep growing, and that I think everything with, from personally to churches, right? If churches are like, well, we've been working on this for such a long time, and it feels like we get great, you got there, you accomplished that. The work's not done though, right? Like, we keep going, and we keep what's next, right? I think that's what's next? What's the next thing that God's calling us to do?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to belabor this too much, but when I have gone around to a lot of churches, I think they're struggling with feeling like they need to keep alive a structure, a committee structure, like these kind of things that actually make a lot of sense. Like, the reason that they were put in is because they make a lot of sense. And so there's then a lot of energy, and there's people who are tired because they're spending a lot of time on some of those type of things.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not putting the energy into maybe some of those other important pieces about what it means to love God and love neighbor. And I think in a lot of ways, we're struggling with that. I try, and when I'm on top of my game, I try to make sure that I have about 3 to 5 one-on-ones a week with different students, and just a chance for me to sit down with somebody and check in, hear about life for them, hear about what God is up to in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And there are those things. I mean, as a campus ministry, we need to fundraise. Like, I can't stop fundraising, right? Like, you can't ever kind of stop doing that. There are these kind of things that have to happen, but how do I make sure that I'm not just getting stuck in the kind of those gears of making the ministry happen, but actually doing the ministry also. But fundraising is also ministry too. I don't mean to say that that's not part of that, but why?
But that you're naming that it's about the care of people.
Right. The ministry doesn't exist to fundraise.
Yeah.
The ministry exists to walk with students and staff and faculty, to share God's grace and love with the world, and to be voices for justice.
And that's why we fundraise.
And exactly. I see echoes of that when Jesus talks about the Sabbath with other, we'll just say, other Jews, about kind of what's the point of the Sabbath? Why do we do the Sabbath? So what comes first? What's the important stuff?
Mm-hmm. And that's what we put first, and that's what we're gearing towards. And I think that's what Jesus is pointing us towards, right?
Yeah.
That's all
Absolutely.
we can do.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Pastor Ray, for joining us today and sharing your wisdom in our conversation. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hey, AJ, I really appreciate you and your ministry. I remember when you were at Northern Iowa and doing some great ministry there. It's like, whoa, here's this person who just is passionate about what God is up to and is doing it. And that was and you continue to inspire me and others. And I just, give thanks for you.
Well, well, golly. Thanks, Ray. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Virtual hug.
Yeah. All right. Everyone, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week. You can learn more about the 10-Foot Pole Podcast at 10footpolepodcast.com and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10-Foot Pole Podcast, and of course, wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, the 10-Foot Pole Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care.